Welcome, everyone. My name is Lisa Leff, and I'm the director of the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies here at the museum. Thank you for being here with us today, whether you're here in person in the auditorium in Washington, or if you're joining us over the live stream. For our online audience, I encourage you to join the conversation on social media and to invite all of your friends to tune in now. You can share your reflections and questions on Facebook and Twitter using hashtag AskWhy or hashtag USHMM. This is the second program in the museum's two-part series, Hate and Its Impact. One of our key goals here at the museum is to educate people about history and to help them understand hate, which can take many forms. In this two-part series, we're exploring the history of racism in Nazi Germany and the history of racism in the Jim Crow South during the 1930s, in order to illuminate some universal phenomena that manifested itself during these two historical eras. In both Nazi Germany and the Jim Crow South, we see racist ideologies that trace part of their roots to the rise of a new science of eugenics, which became an important international movement. Racism, including racial anti-Semitism, was a core element of Nazi ideology and a driving force behind the Holocaust. Also, racism legitimized the continued subjugation and persecution of African Americans long after the end of slavery. These two cases tell us a lot about hate and its impact, and that's why we're exploring them today. It's an honor now to introduce our esteemed expert panelists. Dr. Beverly Eileen Mitchell is a professor of historical theology at Wesley Theological Seminary. She's a valuable member of the museum's Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust. She teaches courses in historical, systematic, and contextual theology, church history, including African American religious history, as well as human rights. She's the author of numerous articles and book chapters, and also two books. The first is called Black Abolitionism, The Quest for Human Dignity, and she's also the author of Plantations and Death Camps, Religion, Ideology, and Human Dignity. Her more recent scholarship has focused on the challenges to human dignity in the face of white supremacy, economic injustice, and genocide. Our second panelist is Dr. James Q Whitman, who's the Ford Foundation Professor of Comparative and Foreign Law at the Yale Law School. Jim earned his BA and JD from Yale University and Yale Law School, and he also holds an MA in European History from Columbia and a PhD in Intellectual History from the University of Chicago. Professor Whitman's many articles have been published internationally and across disciplines. He's also been awarded numerous prizes and fellowships throughout his career. He's the author of several books, including The Verdict of Battle, The Law of Victory and the Making of Modern War, Harsh Justice, Criminal Punishment, and the Widening Divide Between America and Europe, and most recently, Hitler's American Model. Third, Dr. Stephen Luckert is the senior curator in the Levine Institute for Holocaust Education here at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He served for 20 years as the curator of the museum's acclaimed permanent exhibition, The Holocaust, and curated 7 other special exhibitions. He's appeared on many media outlets: C-SPAN, CNN, History Channel, NBC Nightly News, Associated Press, and the list goes on. He earned his PhD in Modern European History from the State University of New York at Binghamton, and he has published on Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and Nazi propaganda. And then our final panelist is our guide for this afternoon, our moderator, David Gregory. David is an analyst and a contributor at CNN. He spent nearly 20 years at NBC News, serving as the chief White House correspondent and the host of Meet the Press. He's also the author of How's Your Faith?, a memoir of his faith journey amid the rough and tumble world of broadcast news. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll turn the program over now to David.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Another terrific turnout. I think a sign of both the interest and the urgency of this topic. I think it was Frederick Douglass who said that history is never dead. Unfortunately, it makes the question of racism, anti-Semitism, the relationship between them and the history of Nazi Germany and our own history of racism and slavery in America, something that is still urgent, that is a current event. And obviously these are topics that have been coursing through our very toxic political dialogue in recent days and even these days as we go through this political climate. So it makes this discussion particularly vital and current, and so we're glad you're here. Want to encourage you all to join our conversation. If you're here in the audience with us, look for our representatives. We have some index cards. You can write out a question and I'll review them and we'll weave them into the discussion. We'll do a discussion for about an hour and then we'll include some of your questions. If you are online watching this, we thank you for being here as well. And we ask you to submit questions as well. You can post your questions at #USHMM or #AskWhy, and we'll gather those up and include you in our conversation. Jim, why don't you start us off by reflecting on some of your own work. You wrote the book, Hitler's American Model, and you talk about how the U.S. acted as an inspiration for the Nuremberg laws in Germany. Explain that a little bit.
The research that I did in that book was a shock and a surprise to me. It turns out, when you go into the records, that the Nazi jurists who drafted the Nuremberg laws, these are the notorious racist laws of 1935, I should say, well predating the Holocaust, it's important to say that. The Nazi jurists who drafted the Nuremberg laws went to the United States to look for models. This emerges quite clearly from the records of their deliberations. It's a little bit hard for Americans to digest or accept, but it very much is the case. To understand it, it's worth perhaps mentioning, observing that from the point of view of the Nazis at least, if not from the point of view of everybody today, there was no doubt that the Jews were a distinct race. The Nazis were determined to establish a racist order. When they set about creating the law for this racist order, they understood that there was one natural model to look to, and that was the model of the United States, which had by a wide margin the most highly developed racist regime in the world. A lot of what the Nazis found of interest was found in the Jim Crow South, but it has to be emphasized not exclusively there. There was a great deal of racist American law to be found all over the country, really, and on the federal level as well, especially in American immigration law, which was praised by Hitler in Mein Kampf. And more broadly in what was called anti-miscegenation law, that is law banning racially mixed marriages, which was law produced by states all over the country, including, for example, in the Pacific Northwest. There was a lot for the Nazis to study when they turned to American law, and they studied it very, very carefully.
And this idea, Beverly, of separateness, I mean, that's what slavery was about, and then any move to dial back slavery, and then certainly in Reconstruction, was to maintain the idea of some separateness, so there was not true integration or racial mixing.
Absolutely, and no intention of there being a kind of integration of the African American population. As I reflect on slavery and continuing further, you see that as the push for the Civil War came, there is more and more interest in preserving slavery and preserving the social order that developed there. And so a heightened justification for the kinds of treatment of the slave and ensuring that the system remains develops even further, and after the war, then there's this insistence on maintaining what would be, in many minds, a white society.
And it's interesting, you were making the point, Jim, that the Nazis wanted to make sure Jews were considered a distinct race. The notion of anti-Semitism as somehow broader than Jews doesn't really hold up, right? It never has. It's very specific to Jews, not to someone who would come from, the Middle East per se.
Right. There's a long history of anti-Judaism, anti-Jewish people that arises, in some sense, from the debate or the conflict between the Jews who did not convert to Christianity as opposed to Jews who did. You see elements of it in the New Testament, that you have the seeds for it there. And so there is a long history that's religiously motivated against the Jews, and that expression of anti-Semitism. But what I see and notice, particularly through the 19th century, with the emergence of the social sciences being strengthened, fascination with classification of races, immigration that comes toward the end of the night, a change or shift in terms of who gets in the United States, then you see a racialization of the Jewish people. And so it's an anti-Semitism that becomes racialized.
And Steve, so talk to us then, as they are looking, as the Nazis are coming to power, and then they're looking to the West, to the United States, for a model. What's happening in the U.S. at that time?
Well, you have a kind of an interesting situation, because at the same time that Adolf Hitler comes to power, so does Franklin Roosevelt. They're both confronted with a huge problem caused by the Great Depression, that is massive unemployment. United States, 1933, about 25% of the working population is unemployed. And that unemployment, that economic dislocation, of course, helps to fuel things like xenophobia. I think it increases racism. It increases this fear of others. So that leads to both efforts to, further restrict immigration, or even fear that you're going to be displaced by, whether those are Mexican-American workers or African-American workers or refugees coming from a different country. And so I think that this creates this kind of climate in the United States during the Great Depression.
And it's interesting because you have, certainly in the Reconstructionist South, immediately this sense of what happened to us, right? In the same way that the Germans went through after World War I, which is, who do we blame? What happened to us that would lead them to, to feel all the things that would give rise to the kind of hate that they felt?
Absolutely, and it was commonplace among the Nazis to blame the Jews for having somehow betrayed Germany in 1918, that is at the end of the First World War, although exactly what story it is they were telling is not entirely easy to reconstruct, but it seemed to go without saying, for many Nazis at least, that the Jews must somehow have been responsible for Germany's defeat. Again, it makes very little sense to us, but then there are plenty of ideologies even in America today that don't make a lot of sense to me. I would add one thing to what Beverly said, and to what you said as well, which is that while it's true that eugenics was widely accepted all over the world, there were eugenicists in countries in every part of the globe, There was something distinctive about the US and Nazi Germany, and a little bit later South Africa in particular. These were countries that developed a different sort of draconian discriminatory legislation than you find anywhere else in the world. This wasn't just an expression of whatever the supposed scientific requirements of eugenics might have been. This was something that involved different forms of degradation, of suppression, and oppression of the discriminated against race that are actually hard, for which it's hard to find parallels outside this small number of countries.
Well, where I would beg to differ a bit here is if you look at Germany's colonial past and also the colonial past of other Europeans. I mean, even in Imperial Germany, you had bans on marriages, for instance, in German Southwest Africa and other colonies in Samoa and others, and those predate that. And they also were doing racial studies, so to speak, of some of those populations. So there was this interest already, even that predates the Nazis and predates, one might say, this interest in the United States. I think they had their own models that they could draw on.
Well, that's true up to a point, but in fact, they looked to the U.S. even with regard to Southwest Africa. There was actually a German study group at the time that went to the U.S. There were requests for information sent to the U.S. Embassy about how Jim Crow worked. Even in that period, so 1905, 1910, the Germans were already looking to the U.S. model. That's not to say, it's not to take a view on the very controversial question of whether Nazism and somehow was prefigured by what went on during the German colonization of Southwest Africa. There's just not general agreement.
Do we have a sense in real time, Beverly, whether government officials here started to take notice of the fact that the Germans were looking at the U.S. past and present at the time for that kind of discrimination?
Well, that I can't really speak to. I think you, Jim, might have
not
more
to
of a
my
notion.
knowledge particularly.
It was compartmentalized in lots of ways that it was at the time. Specifically, though, Jim, as they were constructing the Nuremberg laws, what specifically did they pattern after what they saw in U.S. In segregation and Jim Crow system?
The most direct borrowing, if I can use the word borrowing, it's another controversial term, involved American anti-miscegenation law once again. The Nazis were determined not only to ban racially mixed marriages, but to criminalize them. And although there were some very, very vague and uncertain models for banning mixed marriages elsewhere, just a little bit in Australia, here and there you would find it, criminalization of mixed marriage was simply unimaginable for most of the world. It was only in the United States that you saw criminalization, and in fact, harsh criminalization. That was something of great appeal to the Nazis, and as we go through the records, what we discover in particular is that the most radical Nazis, it may sound strange to say that there were radical Nazis and more moderate Nazis, but there were. The most radical Nazis were the ones who were the biggest fans of the American way of doing things. As I say, the most direct borrowings involved anti-miscegenation law, mixed marriages. The Nuremberg laws also created a new form of second-class citizenship, of course, for German Jews. And there, again, the Nazis had models, but American models, but models from which it was more difficult to borrow directly.
Yeah, so Beverly, it's worth illustrating what we're talking about in terms of what they were trying to model. Help us understand the similarities between what African Americans were experiencing under Jim Crow and what Jews were experiencing under the discrimination of the Nuremberg laws.
Well, it really speaks to this idea of grouping, in the case of the United States, African American as one group, and demonizing, operating off of stereotypes and caricatures, cruel caricatures of African Americans, particularly males, as highly oversexed and predatory toward white women, a feeling that they are incompetent, stupid, lazy, the kind of stereotypes that you still sometimes see. In Nazi Germany, you see them, Jews being put together as a group. The individuality of human beings is completely obliterated. They're a group, and this is what they do, that Jews are greedy, that they are even considering some of the men as lascivious and predatory toward the Aryan female, circumscribing where they can congregate in terms of social functions. The laws function to really eradicate their ability, their economic ability to support themselves, a denial of interaction with others that really mimics what you saw in the South.
And there's this power dynamic that's a little bit different, right, Steve? So here there is the fear that blacks who are oppressed will rise up, that there will be rebellion. I mean, we see that during, in the antebellum South in the Dominican, right? But it's that fear that they would become militarized and take what's theirs, right, in a kind of a South African, fear, similar fear, or that they'll just take more of the economic pie, right? I mean, that's the big problem. If they're enfranchised, all of a sudden you have that issue. And Jews are seen as much more powerful than their numbers would suggest, the ability to, that's why this word hypnotized is so freighted, because that they will trick you, they'll deceive you, and then they'll start using all their tentacles to assert power. But it's the fear of that control at some level there's a parallel, no?
Yeah, I think in some ways there's significant differences, but I think the notion that the Nazis had was that the Jews were a kind of the polar opposite of the so-called Aryan, but that the Jews were driven to gain, to try to take world power, and that they were a parasitic body in that society, but that they used their influence, whether monetary influence, to buy political power or to manipulate other groups. And so that capitalism, communism are all part of the tools that international Jewry wages to take over countries. So that in some ways they don't present the Jews necessarily as inferior, but they're very powerful, and that they represent an existential threat to Germany and to the Western world.
And it's interesting, Jim, at no time, I mean, when they're coming to power, they're not seeing any advances in American society that give them pause with regard to enfranchisement of African Americans, some of the crumbling of, now it's not, it takes a long time to crumble, but they don't see any of that crumbling in the U.S. society?
Not with regard to the enfranchisement of African Americans,
Yeah.
That's for sure. And in fact, when they describe deprivation of voting rights for African Americans, they use precisely the language everybody's been describing here. They say Americans are combating the influence of this alien race. It's how they could possibly have imagined that American blacks were influential. This terribly oppressed group is hard to understand. That said, they were puzzled by the United States. They were well aware that there were other aspects of American constitutional culture and American society that represented a true commitment to liberalism that was deeply inconsistent with all of the Nazi program. And the last analysis, they had a hard time knowing what to make of the U.S. What they sometimes said was that, well, the U.S. seems to be torn between two different approaches. We certainly hope the Nazis would say that eventually they will fully see the light and commit themselves not only to racism, but in particular to anti-Jewish racism.
But it's interesting because they had to take away the fact that we did fight a civil war over this question of slavery. So while we're still torn apart by this time when they're coming to power, they see the schisms in American society and also recognize that the key to their power was authoritarianism, totalitarianism, that it's very hard to pull all of this off if you don't exercise complete control over your society.
Well, I was wanting to pick up on something that Jim was saying because I think it was quite interesting, but it's also, the Nazis also used American policies towards African American and others to attack the United States, so that when Kristallnacht happens, 1938, and Roosevelt issues a condemnation of what happens, what do the Nazis do? Well, they say, well, America, he's being hypocritical. Take a look at his own backyard. And they show photographs of lynchings of African Americans. They show strikes being broken. And they say, he's a hypocrite. You know, that he treats minorities, the United States treats minorities, you know, in a bad way, and yet they have the gall to attack us for the way we treat Jews. And so they condemned, likewise, Churchill for the abuse of colonial peoples, and said, again, this is, how can they dare attack us for what we did, given what they do to their own minorities?
I mean, the criticism is accurate. I mean, Beverly, if you go back to, and again, I think people forget when we talk about the Jews in Nazi Germany and forced deportation and torture, and then ultimately, you know, mass murder, a campaign of murder that was waged against African Americans over a long period of time in the South.
Well, exactly. If I could incorporate something from what Steve said earlier, I think we're talking about the similarities, which I think between Nazi Germany and the Jim Crow South, which are indeed there, but it is also important to keep in mind the real differences as we talk about this. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight, in both cases, we're talking about how white supremacy functions. And whereas, as Steve rightly describes, the difference in terms of Jews in Nazi Germany being seen as a threat, seeing as having all this tremendous influence despite their population. On the other hand, in terms of how white supremacy worked in the South, there's this concerted effort to emphasize the inferiority of the African Americans. So we're talking about white supremacy, but we're talking about two different ways that it functioned, both here and in Germany as well. And so that's what sort of makes the comparison between the two a little complicated at times. But indeed, we do see, as we reflect on what happens through the Jim Crow period, the lynchings, the challenging of African Americans to be able to serve their country, et cetera, et cetera. It's, for me at least, in terms of looking at the way white supremacy functions, it's the way in which both groups are dehumanized, and that the degradation that results from that, and the reaction of Jews in Nazi Germany who get caught up in what happens with the camps, and likewise the experience of African Americans and their degradation. There is the similarity that I find.
But underline that key difference, again, about white supremacy in terms of making the other feel inferior, because that was certainly, that is a similarity, right?
Yes.
If you look at both groups, but you see an important distinction as well.
But the trying to rationalize how you dehumanize by saying this group has tremendous influence, they are, in one instance, this is what you have, and the other, it's a kind of way of looking at them, the African American, as decidedly incapable of self-determination, of all these things. And so some of the results will be different as we look at the two histories.
It is a really interesting point, because, I mean, you go back to the Dred Scott decision, and it was to not recognize as someone with standing as a human being in America. And it does, there was influence, certainly, but the idea was that you had property that now all of a sudden wanted to become human in the eyes of Americans, and that was deemed as unacceptable. Whereas, right, in Nazi Germany, it was different. There was a dehumanization aspect of it for sure, but it was that power over them that they felt was is the biggest of deals. I mean, do you agree or no?
Well, I think they were more confused than that, the Nazis, actually. They did conceive of themselves as a white supremacist movement, and it's very striking that in the early periods of the development of Nazi legislation, what they targeted was not Jews, but colored people. Now, this led to a paradox which puzzled people in 1933 and 1934, Jews who all of a sudden found themselves characterized as colored, although they didn't, when they looked in the mirror, think they saw a colored person. It led to many complex legal debates that I could go into, but won't here, about what it might mean to target colored people in the United States. But lying in the background was the notion, indeed, that what the Nazis were, as it were, offering the world was an improved form of white supremacy, modeled in all kinds of ways on what had gone on, especially in the English-speaking parts of the world, to which they made reference all the time. I mean, it's also worth mentioning with regard to the Holocaust, well, two things. It's very, very important to distinguish the pre-Holocaust and post-Holocaust periods in the history of Nazi politics. I mean, in the early 1930s, there was no question of mass murder. I'm sure Hitler would have been on board for it if it could have been done, but it wasn't politically possible, and nobody was really talking in such terms. Nevertheless, there was an interest in an American model for mass murder, which Hitler mentioned already in 1928, and which was often mentioned in the 1940s. But that was the conquest of the West and the extermination of the Native Americans. This was something of great interest to Nazi Germans, many of whom, by the way, had been brought up on novels, particularly there was a famous author named Karl May, novels about the American West and you know, the 19th century equivalent of comic books about the American West. They often like to describe themselves as experiencing their own form of manifest destiny, just heading east rather than west, as the Americans had done.
And what was the idea then of, before Holocaust, remind us what the thinking was about what to do about the Jews?
They wanted to expel the Jews. They wanted the Jews to emigrate, whether voluntarily or under compulsion. That led, by the way, to one of the most shocking little bits of information that turned up for me, at least, in the research for my book. The most important Nazi expert on American law, since you mentioned the Civil War before, mentioned as his own great heroes Jefferson and Lincoln. How could he have thought that Jefferson and Lincoln were models for Hitler? The answer is that both Jefferson and Lincoln, at various points, were very much in favor of resettling the African-American population somewhere else. That's exactly what Nazi policy favored in the early 1930s. So, you know, one's jaw drops when one reads literature of the Nazis in the early 1930s praising Jefferson and Lincoln, but that's the reason that they said it.
Did you want to add something, Beverly?
No, I just, it's astonishing and also understandable as to why they would view both these figures as offering a model.
Because, I mean, again, I mean, it is a model. I mean, it's not an irrational thing. Those were conversations that were happening. I mean, Lincoln was trying to draw Frederick Douglass into that, into supporting the expulsion movement and the idea of a colony. So,
and you had a long history in the United States of finding ways to remove, particularly the free black population here in the U.S. with the colonization movement and other attempts because of this conviction that the two racial groups would not be able to live together socially.
What about, Steve, the idea during World War II of the Double V campaign? I mean, this was a hope of African Americans joining the war effort. How does that impact all of this?
Well, I think that at the same time that you're having this interest in let's say, Nazi interest in what's happening in America, you're having changes that are going on in the United States, too. More calls of attention to what's happening to African Americans. You've also got, efforts on the part of, African Americans taking an interest in what's happening in Ethiopia and getting involved in that. I think there's the notion even with getting more benefits out of the New Deal. for African Americans. And I think with the war, there's this notion, as there was, I think, in the First World War too, an expectation that, you defeat racism at home, you're also going to defeat racism here, and that out of this will come progress. But of course, there was a long period of time that took much longer than 1945. I mean, it's only after the war that you have the army desegregated, and and then if you think about, it's 20 years or so after that that you have a lot of important gains in civil rights legislation.
Part of a long struggle, the African American, it is not as though that they worked very hard in terms of abolition. Black abolitionists worked very hard toward this quest for the recognition, not only of ending slavery, but the recognition of their human dignity, the fullness of participating in what it is that makes people human, so that they could participate in this country. And they worked consistently through Reconstruction, and following that failure, racial uplift. They were always working and agitating toward getting their rights. And so I think the continuing struggle also with regard to whether they could participate in the army, even as far back as the Revolutionary War. That was with the hope that they would be seen and viewed as a people who were valuable and who could serve this country. That's why you don't see this, you see from time to time, particularly as African Americans got discouraged about the prospect of ever achieving their full citizenship and recognition of them as full human beings. From time to time, they would think, well, we have to give this up. Let's go elsewhere because we're never going to attain it here. But for the most part, they continued to press for this note. They believed in the American experiment, and they wanted to be part of the American experiment, and they continued to wrestle with that.
Particularly, and I'll just remind folks as we continue our discussion that we'll collect your questions here in the hall, and if you're watching online, you can submit it as well using the museum hashtag or hashtag AskWhy as well, and we'll get to your questions in just a few minutes. It's interesting, Jim, if you think about even then the civil rights struggle, and that there are a lot of American Jews who participate in common cause in the civil rights struggle, how much of that was an outgrowth of the experience of World War II and Nazi Germany, or was that also, was it more progressive politics that had a lot of American Jews forming common cause with African Americans?
Well, I'm not an expert on that question, I have to say. It has to be said with regard to the civil rights movement more broadly, including, of course, many, many Jews who participated, that as Mary Dudziak explained in her wonderful book, Cold War Civil Rights, which I recommend to everybody, the civil rights movement as it took hold in the 1950s was self-consciously understood as not only an anti-Nazi movement, but a response to the charges mounted against America by the communists at the time. So that the international setting for all of this matters a great deal. That's not directly responsive to your question. I will say, by the way, though, that German Jews, too, believed in Germany.
Right.
And were shocked by their exclusion. I mean, unlike African Americans, they had actually fought as full-fledged soldiers in World War I.
Right. And that's one of the reasons why they didn't emigrate, right? They thought this can't last, or they didn't understand.
Some left in 1933 and returned.
Wow.
Because they thought it really wasn't going to turn out to be quite as bad as everybody had imagined. But I think it was very, very difficult, especially until Kristallnacht, so this is in November of 1938. It was still possible for German Jews to imagine that somehow, under these awful Jim Crow-like circumstances, they might nevertheless survive and maintain a kind of a place in German society. After 38, it became clear that that was not going to be possible.
Can I speed us up to current days a little bit and try to use this historical frame to discuss some of what's coursing through our society today? Beverly, before we came out, I was making the observation that there's a view, there seems to be some distance between anti-Semitism and racism in the way that it's experienced in America today. And that's a source of division. It's the kind of division that we see playing out, I think, among American progressives, say. And Israel tends to be the focal point there, which is such a heavy topic because it gets into how Jews went from victimhood to governing their own country, and then how they treat, those in their own country, especially in territories that are disputed. So what's your thought about that as you use the historical frame to look at what's happening today?
Well, I find since Charlottesville that I've really had to do a lot of rethinking about how I thought about racial anti-Semitism and how I see the connection between that and racism in ways that I hadn't thought of before, particularly because what you see in Charlottesville is that two main groups are targeted in terms of the way in which the white nationalists and others came in. Yes, the African American is a target, remains a target in the South, but I was really struck by how anti-Semitism was also very much in the forefront. So they in the minds of those, particularly on the right, they are viewed as siblings in a way that need to be that are viewed as highly problematic for this society. What I'm finding with regard to what's happening currently, what we're seeing is the presence of anti-Semitism from the progressive left. And neither of these, I mean, I think it needs to be pointed out that none of this is new in the sense that it's always there. But because of the climate of this country, it is now fashionable to speak about it openly and irresponsibly if we choose to. And so I think there's a kind of permission given to this expression. But the anti-Semitism on the left and the right, what we may be seeing is a shifting where they're both together present and vocal at the same time, whereas in the past it seems that maybe the right was stronger and the left, was kind of not as visible, and so that there is a shifting in time in terms of...
And there's some commonality, but for different reasons.
Right.
You guys want to comment on this dynamic today?
Well, I think what you have today, and this is something that the museum is very involved in, is looking at the increase in anti-Semitism globally. I mean, you're seeing this in Europe, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and France. The increase in anti-Semitic rhetoric and anti-Semitic incidents. And, it's worrisome because you see a lot of the same tropes and canards that were used in that time period that kind of have been recirculated and recycled with a new purpose. Now, it's often, for some people, you don't want to say, I'm an anti-Semite. You can say, I'm an anti-Zionist. Use the same tropes. But you don't, because anti-Semitism has a bad name, just as before anti-Jewish had a bad name, so you use anti-Semitism. It sounds scientific. And so you're seeing a lot of this development going on, but it's also there is the, and it's being spread by different ways, whether that's social media or other ways. And you see a lot of the same things, whether it's being peddled at the Iranian Holocaust cartoon contest,
right,
or many other things.
Jim, thoughts?
I don't understand anti-Semitism. There are real mysteries. In some ways, it goes back to antiquity. It goes back to the 3rd century BC, even before the religious traditions that you've described. And it is, to me at least, one of the most difficult and tragic mysteries of, not really just of Western history, because there's anti-Semitism in Japan. This is a virus that's managed to infect the most extraordinary range of societies, and it's very. I throw up my hands. I have to say, I can't explain why it happens.
But can you comment on a couple of dynamics? One, what Beverly mentioned, which is this permission that seems to exist to engage more openly, as you said, in irresponsible talk, and then periods where anti-Semitism seemed to be more dormant as compared to more expressive.
I'm flattered that you would think I had an answer to that question.
When I see you, I think this is a man with answers.
It's certainly true that there's, above all in this respect, but that in others, a culture of civility has vanished in the United States that was protecting us in the last analysis against more than just rudeness. It was protecting us against the worst sort of politics, and there's absolutely no doubt that it's reemerged. What can explain that? Once again, I wish I could come here on the stage and tell everybody why things are happening the way they're happening in this world, but I can't.
But that's really the critical question, though. What I think that we really need to look at is what are the factors, what are the elements that make this a time in which you have this emergence. As I think about the United States, I can't help but tie what's going on in the U.S. with the election and re-election of Barack Obama and what that may or may not have signified to some people. But in terms of this global increase in anti-Semitism, I think about the possibility of economics, the feeling that some are not able to advance as much as they think they should. But I think it's something that we really do need to look at.
But you said it before, Steve, about the election of FDR and the sense of malaise that was happening in America then, which led to the question of, what's happening to us, what's happened to us, and who are we? Ultimately, who are we? Which I feel like is much more caught up in where we are today. This sense of, who are we? Because we're, all of a sudden, there's much more autonomy over telling our own stories. And I think, for instance, this Confederate memorial situation is a kind of taking back of revisionist history that was, Reconstruction history that said to blacks, no, you're never going to be free. And we're going to put up monuments to cast in stone what that represented. And a kind of taking back and saying, no, we'll tell our own story now, thank you. And a kind of relearning, but it's still about this question of then who are we? And there's a lot of debates about, no, that's not really who we are. It's not who we should be. And there's a lot of that tension.
But that raises the issue of immigration, particularly from the South. And it raises anti-Muslim sentiment as well, and the feeling that the feeling that this country, as in which some equate Americanness with whiteness, and the fact that you're having an invasion of people who are classified as non-white, what does that mean in terms of the so-called browning of America?
Well, it kind of goes, Jim, to this question that we got from the audience, looking at the historical record. How do we avoid the next wave of white supremacy within our political culture? What lesson can we take from history to put us on a different path? But we, just as, with the Nuremberg laws, there was a sense of who is superior, therefore who is inferior, which plays itself out still today.
It certainly does. You know, the problem, from my point of view, is that the best answer is that we need more enlightenment and a kind of consciousness raising among people. That's the hardest thing to engineer, though. Mm-hmm. You know, you would say, well, we go into the schools and we teach the kids not to surrender to whatever racist or discriminatory impulses they might have. But, you know, that kind of teaching can be terribly counterproductive. Sometimes the kids react against it and do exactly the opposite. Succeeding in that sort of program of enlightenment requires gifts that very, very few teachers, unfortunately, in the end have. But it seems to me that the most important thing is to change attitudes in that way, and I'm afraid that's a counsel of despair on the last analysis. It's hard to know.
Can you say something about Germany? We were starting to talk about this in the elevator, which is that sense of reconciliation with their past, which I don't know the history of how that's played out, but there is some sense, I think in America, well, we see it all the time in our modern dialogue about, well, hey, you know, people will say, why am I responsible for racism? I didn't do it. My parents didn't do it. Just because I'm white, it's my fault that there's racism or that there was slavery? Like, when am I let off the hook for that? How much of that has played out, that attitude, how much of that has played out in Germany as well?
Well, you see that it's over the course of decades, there's been changes in thinking in Germany, so that, for instance, in the 1960s, you start having this kind of awakening about that past. You know, after the war, the Allies made a concerted effort to re-educate the German population about, you know, the responsibility for the Nazis and all of that. But then in the 1960s, you have a number like the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial, you've got the Eichmann trial, that raise questions about what the previous generation did, and in cooperation also with the student rebellion. Then almost in every generation, there was a discussion, for instance, about the role of the army. Mm-hmm. So what had been previously viewed as kind of a clean institution was now challenged. And so then the question is, you know, then it moves further about, you know, what is the responsibility of ordinary Germans and their complicity or collaboration in this history. So it's kind of an ongoing process. But even there you have some challenges coming particularly from the far right, you know, raising how long is enough? Why is it that we're the only country in the world that puts a capital, in their capital, this monument of shame, you know, this memorial to the Jews that were murdered during the Holocaust, or to say that this, as one right-wing politician said in Germany, that, you know, Nazi Germany is just, you know, that period is just bird shit on the you know, and the history of Germany. It's one small thing, part of that history. So they're grappling with that still, but I think that Germany has made far greater efforts at trying to confront its past. First being forced to confront its past, but then also interacting with that and engaging with that history.
Does anybody have a thought? This comes from a question on Twitter about the way in our school systems we teach and emphasize slavery versus the Holocaust. Are those parallels there? Are they equal? Is there a different level of emphasis, if you know, if you've had some exposure?
That I don't know, and I would hope that that's a tricky thing about comparisons,
right?
What makes it problematic. I think at the crux of why the U.S. is different in terms of how, from Germany, in terms of how Germany has been forced to deal with their past, we are not here. We have not, as a nation, dealt with honestly and openly with the painful aspects of our history with regard to the Native Americans and with regard to the African Americans. Mm-hmm. And unless and until we engage that, we're going to be limping along. We're going to constantly have eruptions because of we have not addressed what is essentially a cancer. It was there from the inception of this country.
Well, and that goes to your point about President Obama, which is the election of the first African-American president and the sense of, oh, well, so this must be over now,
Right.
all of these problems. But related to that, we got a question from the audience to it's the point about contradiction in American life and history, that how do we wrestle with the contradiction of what we are and have been? So here we liberate Europe and the Jews, and we have the Jim Crow South. How do we? And so a question about, can you say more about how black intellectuals and the black press seized upon the parallels that we're talking about here to compel FDR and Truman to make change, to change broader American hearts and minds? Anybody want to take that on?
I do know that a translation of an article by the main German student of American race, whom I mentioned before, appeared in the Chicago Defender in 1936. At that time already, at least African Americans were conscious of the parallels, and that's only one example, and we're making understandable noise about them. That doesn't seem to have had the effect one might have hoped it would have. For that period, it's also important. I've said uncomfortable things about Jefferson and Lincoln. It's important to say something uncomfortable about FDR too.
Sure.
Which is that he depended on the support of the Democrats of the South.
Yes.
And was very, very reluctant, certainly into the late 1930s, to challenge what was, after all, the basis of Democratic support, right down until the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson famously said, "I've just surrendered the White House," that is the Rights Act, to the Republicans for the next generation. There's a very fraught history of relations between the Democratic Party and American racism that we haven't faced. That's a narrower question than how the country in general has faced or not faced this problem, but boy, it has to be mentioned in this connection.
Yeah. It's exceedingly messy, but I don't see making progress with if we try to skirt this. As an American who had relatives who fought in World War II, and a father who was involved in the Korean War, for fighting for democracy, for freedom, et cetera, I'm proud to be an American, but that doesn't mean you can't be honest and critical about the mistakes this country has made and continues to make, and a kind of patriotism that is uncritical is unhelpful to everybody.
Right. There's no ending to the sense of expertise that our audience thinks everybody has, and this is not directly on point, but it's just an interesting question. If the Nazis would not have tried to exterminate the Jews and spend their efforts on the war instead, might the outcome of the war been different?
When I was in graduate school, they always said never deal with counterfactual history, what ifs, but then they wouldn't have been Nazis. If they weren't so imbued with this anti-Semitism and this racism, they wouldn't be Nazis.
Right. That's a good
and for the Nazis, it was, they divided up populations into whether they had value or not. So that, for instance, you even had, the laws not only dictating, that Jews, whom Jews or Germans could marry, but even among Germans, if you had particular types of diseases, you could be banned from, you could be sterilized, you could be banned from being married. And also some of these laws, like the Nuremberg laws, later got applied, for instance, to blacks and also to Roma and Sinti, the so-called gypsies. And then you had, during the war years, this kind of broadening this out, what considers to be race pollution or race defilement, so that it's placed on, for instance, Polish civilians or forced conscript laborers from Poland and from the occupied Soviet Union.
Yeah. Jim, this is an interesting question. You brought up immigration earlier, and we got a question on the live stream. How did racism in the U.S. influence the refusal to admit Jewish refugees?
It did, in fact.
Yeah.
It very much did. In particular, dating back to the 19th century, there were race-based immigration laws in the United States. It's particularly in the 1920s, 21 and especially 24, that a national origins, as we called it, form of immigration law came into force, intended, among other things, to prevent Eastern European Jews from making their way to the United States. Actually, my Jewish ancestors made it just under the wire, right before the 1924 Act. And as I believe I mentioned before, that was legislation that Hitler found praiseworthy.
Right.
He said in Mein Kampf, the United States is the one country that is making progress toward creating a healthy race order. And what he had in mind was precisely that immigration legislation of the 1920s, which was, and in part because it was designed to keep Jews out of the United States.
But there was also, as it got later, it was also this idea that there were spies, right? That there were German spies among the Jews, right, who would come and infiltrate America.
There were German spies everywhere.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, that was part of that hysteria that started, even in the early 30s. The notion that Nazi Germany was trying to influence and shape America and then engage in sabotage and infiltrate and change America, destroy American society. You had congressional investigations. HUAC, which we know about from the post-war era mostly, was set up in 1938 to address those fears.
Although it's worth mentioning, I think, that both the German society and American society distinguish between German Jews and Eastern European Jews. German Jews had a much easier time advancing in American society than Eastern European Jews did, didn't face the same kind of discrimination, for that matter, in immigration. And in Germany, too, in particular, it was the East European Jews who, not only for the so-called Germans, the ones the Nazis characterized as Germans, but the German Jews as well, represented the wrong form of, so that there's, the story is more complicated than one just about Jews.
Right.
There are a lot of complicated hostilities, unjustifiable classifications. There's a lot going on in both countries.
Yeah.
Well, even American immigration law doesn't identify Jews as one of the groups. I mean, it's by nationality. So German Jews come under a German, Polish Jews come under the Polish quota. But, often, like in Romania, and of course by the late 30s, almost all those that are coming in from Germany are Jews that are trying to escape Nazi persecution.
There's another question that came up about the internment of the Japanese and whether there was, were there similar classifications used for the Japanese that were interned in this country after the attack at Pearl Harbor. Any parallel with what we're discussing here?
I mean, that is one of the most shameful moments in American history, the internment of the Japanese. Nevertheless, just speaking as a lawyer for the moment, I would say there's a difference, not an acceptable or justifiable difference, but there's a difference in interning members of what was regarded as an enemy nationality. Now, these were American Japanese. So it's not as though they were, in fact, hostile individuals, anything like that. But in the wartime context, I suppose you could say that this was a different sort of a program. And I must say again, I don't say that in order to justify it at all for a moment, but to say that I can understand how lawyers might have conceived this as representing a different sort of program.
But the parallel, I guess, is in terms of the experience of those who were interned, and that the experience of those who were dehumanized and degraded in those contexts. And when you hear their stories of their experiences, this is what connects these disparate groups together, at least for me, as a theologian. What does it mean in terms of how we dehumanize, and what does it mean to be human? And do we lose our humanness in those contexts?
I want to end, yeah, go ahead.
But I was just going to add to what Jim said, because it's interesting when you get into some of those debates about it. It's the lawyers in the Department of Justice that are the ones that are opposing it, because they have the problems with it. It's the Army commanders and some of these civilians that want to intern the Japanese. It's the Department of Justice that has, and even the FBI says, well, there's not really a justification.
I think you're right, and I shouldn't have even ventured the thought. To think through how you might see this as something different when it's so manifestly not.
Let me conclude on this thought, which is it's an important historical conversation, and yet it's got urgency now. And one of the reasons it has urgency is what we learn from history. And it's not just that we have your expertise and the benefit of hindsight, but it impacts on how we combat fear and what's our role as citizens then today. So each of you just reflect on that for a moment about the modern role of citizenry armed with this knowledge and seeing the manifestations of this kind of fear today. Beverly, why don't you start?
What a question. The fear piece, I'm not sure that we spend enough time reckoning with what are the reasons for that fear, because what we're dealing with is something that's non-rational. Mm-hmm. And so that's more of a challenge in terms of how you go about combating something like that. But I struggle with how we do respond to it, and how might we be helpful. We've got this knowledge, information, you can get it anywhere. Mm-hmm. But touching hearts of people, openness to what's really going on inside our communities that's a real tough thing to wrestle with.
Steve, I feel like, particularly in the media, we're very good at capturing outrage. That's what we do. We're less good at identifying what people are afraid of, mm-hmm. and exploring it, mm-hmm. So that people can sit with it and see if it makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a challenge for all of us. But I run across this, sometimes when I'm out speaking, that there's both this fear that you see globally, that your society is being changed. And a lot of it, as the Nazis were masters of it, playing on fear is a great tool for a great tactic for propagandists, because people are more driven by emotions than they are by reason. And so if you play up those fears, that your life is going to be changed, that everything that you've loved is going to be destroyed, you can use that to gain political influence and votes. But there's also another fear that I've encountered, and that is people come up to me and say, I want to say something, but I'm afraid. That they want to engage in some type of counter-narrative to challenge those ideas, but they don't want to put themselves out alone, mm-hmm. because they know they'll be subject to bullying or attacks by those particular groups. And so sometimes it's, they found that, working with other groups that have similar visions, that sometimes being a part of that to counter those hateful messages can be very important.
Mm-hmm.
I would have said the most important thing was to vote against the politicians who engage in fear-mongering. There's more counsel to spare, though, for the moment. The difficulty is that we have an American constitutional order that magnifies the power of states that are the reservoirs of this kind of politics now. And it's very, very difficult to see how we can escape that at the moment. That, getting over that obstacle requires serious constitutional reform in the United States. That's a little bit hard to imagine at the moment.
Yeah. I think, my concluding thought would be that our role as citizens and voting is extremely important, but I think that's not everything, because I think it's how we interact with each other is also as important, and we have the means now to communicate with each other in ways that we never had before. We're also, in my experience, experiencing a level of paralysis in our ability to speak to each other like I've never seen before. I've never been alive during a time when it was so hard to talk about politics openly. And we in the media tailor, we tailor to you, in that sense, to all of us, because we allow people to stay in their own zone, their safe space, whatever they believe, and not be challenged and not be confronted. And so there's an obligation to call things out and I think try to understand where people are coming from. To your point, try to give some room for people to say, I am, I don't want to be afraid about saying this. I'm confused about this. I'm angry about this. You're not going to be able to deal with the haters. The people who perpetrated the crimes that this museum details, just not going to be able to negotiate that conversation. That has to be opposed and challenged in a different way, and was militarily. But we have this obligation to keep trying to have these conversations, given that we're in an age where the exchange of information and views is everywhere. So thank you all very much for your thoughtfulness. And thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to the next occasion. Thank you so much.